Hello, everyone. In this episode, we will talk about Miguel de Cervantes, once again with Stefano Reali, interviewed by Gianluca Lamberti of the channel Facciamo, finta. Reali continues with his story. From Cervantes to Florio, we need to make a quantum leap. They lived more or less in the same historical period, from 1550 to 1615, and had many things in common. Cervantes and Florio met at least twice in surprising circumstances over the span of 40 years. Let's clarify one thing. The 1500s was the peak period of the Inquisition across Europe. This means that during that time, which the Spaniards call El Siglo de Oro, the Golden Century, alongside witnessing the birth of great artists, mathematicians, historians, jurists, musicians, architects, sculptors, painters, and incredibly talented writers, it was also a period in which one could not freely express their thoughts. This meant that an intellectual had to be a man of action. He couldn't just be a gentleman with hunched shoulders, small glasses, and dandruff, dedicated to study in a somewhat hunched manner like Leopardi. He had to be a man of action, muscular, skilled in fencing, escaping, and hand-to-hand combat. He had to have the physical ability to flee and save his life from all the threats his thoughts would lead him to face. State threats, governmental threats, threats from lords, nobles, and masters. In Italy, we had the Greek and Latin cultures, we had the Renaissance, we had Dante and Boccaccio, and an endless series of storytellers, poets, and writers who had created the habit of what we now call fiction. This did not happen in Spain. In Spain, this tradition did not exist until the printing press was invented around 1450. Spain was a country devoid of literary traditions, and when the first chivalric poems were translated and printed, the Spaniards did not yet clearly understand the distinction between fiction and reality. So when they read about these heroes, they got so excited that some of them, those less ready to grasp the difference between fiction and reality, would literally go mad. They would take to the streets and dream of hunting down great villains, great marauders, liberating damsels, freeing villages from the yoke of a marauder, and thus the figure of the errant knight was born, one who moves without any purpose other than to bring justice. Let's move forward a few years to 1547, when Miguel de Cervantes was born, the fourth of 7 children in a practically illiterate family. Little Miguel, however, from an early age, showed an incredible desire to read and write, and his father, sacrificing himself, tried in every way to send him to school. But the schooling was never regular because the father was constantly moving from city to city to escape his creditors due to debts. Nonetheless, Miguel cultivated his passion for writing and showed a strange, very unusual affinity for everything Italian. When he reached the age of 18 or 19, without having had the chance to pursue proper studies, he wrote a poem in memory of the Queen of Spain, who had died a few days earlier. He and his teacher decided to have it read to the king, who was grieving over his loss. Once inside the royal palace, however, a gentleman mistook him for a wrongdoer. The two clashed, and Cervantes managed to wound the man, but unfortunately for him, that man was Antonio de Segura, one of the familiars of the Inquisition, and therefore an informant, but above all, a nobleman very close to the royal family. When Miguel realized the mistake he had made, he fled. He was tried in absentia and sentenced to have his right hand cut off, which was the penalty at that time that the Spanish state imposed on anyone who committed acts of violence inside the royal palace. Naturally, Miguel was not willing to have his right hand cut off, so he escaped, fled in a dramatic way, taking advantage of an acquaintance he had made precisely for the Queen's funeral, namely Cardinal Acquaviva, a Vatican diplomat in Spain. Cervantes managed to hide in his entourage and go to Rome. Miguel Cervantes arrived in Rome and worked for 2 years as a servant for Cardinal Giulio Acquaviva, a very young cardinal of 23, known for his blatant homosexuality and belonging to a very noble and powerful family. He had a formidable personal library, a library that our Miguel forced to hide because he was wanted by the Spanish police, literally devoured in those 2 years, during which he mastered Italian. He spoke it better than Spanish. In Spanish, he stuttered, but in Italian, he did not. After some time, the cardinal, realizing that Miguel was not willing to become his lover, denounced him to the Spanish police, forcing him to flee to Naples, where Cervantes had to embark on a schooner that would become part of the fleet that would fight the Turks in what would become famous as the Battle of Lepanto. The Battle of Lepanto was an unimaginably large battle, with 18,000 Turks against 12,000 Christians. Imagine 30,000 men battling on the same body of water in a single day. Cervantes knew that the only way to escape justice was to hide under a false name on a Spanish schooner. He boarded, managed to get accepted as an arquebusier, and spoke perfectly in both Italian and Spanish. The day of the battle arrived, October 7th, 1571, and he knew that the only way not to arouse suspicion was to fight. But his fervor was short-lived. That day he was also ill, because a rival in love, a certain Geronimo de Pasamonte, also a poet and soldier, had poisoned him by giving him spoiled food to get revenge for a girl they had both courted in Naples. So Cervantes was sick, but wanted to fight anyway. He knew that if he shirked, there was a danger that someone would find out who he really was. As we said, his fervor was short-lived. After a minute and a half, a shot from an arquebus took away his left hand, and another shot wounded him in the chest. He managed to return alive to Messina, where the surgeons at the Messina Hospital, the largest hospital in Europe with 2,000 beds, treated him. It was a hospital built especially for the veterans of the Spanish campaigns in the Mediterranean against the Turks and Arabs, where battles had been fiercely fought for centuries. Miguel spent 5 months between life and death. In the end, he survived, but they had to amputate his left hand. It was during this period that Cervantes received a visit from a 19-year-old named John Florio, their first meeting. We know that Florio was fleeing to England after traveling all over Europe with a father wanted by the Inquisition. Miguel de Cervantes and John Florio, two young men who did not know they would become immortal as writers, and who at that moment confronted each other only on the one possible thing. Miguel de Cervantes was all courage, all fervor and warlike spirit, while John was prudent. His father had always told him to stay away from trouble. They were wanted, they were Protestants. After a few days, Cervantes was forced to flee again from the Spanish authorities, who had tracked him down, and the only thing he knew how to do, the only thing he had learned, was to be a sailor. He changed his name again and boarded other Spanish schooners, and every time he was discovered, he was forced to flee and change his name each time. After 3 years of war and heroic acts, even Don Juan of Austria, having learned of his moving story, found a way to write him letters of commendation, saying, "With these, go to Spain, return to Spain, and I, who am the king's brother, say that you are a man who has saved the honor of Spain on many occasions. There will surely be judicial pardon." Cervantes was overjoyed. In the meantime, he had also reunited with his brother Rodrigo, who had emulated him by following him into battle. Finally, after 5 years, he returned on a schooner that would bring him back to Spain. But this schooner, just a few hundred meters from the Costa Brava, was attacked by Arab-Turkish pirates who infested the Mediterranean and literally deported hundreds of thousands of Christians to their cities: Tunis, Algiers, Alexandria of Egypt, and naturally, Constantinople. Cervantes was taken to Algiers. He knew he wouldn't survive because the living conditions were atrocious. The prisons in Algiers were gigantic underground circular caves housing 40 to 50 prisoners, with enormous latrines like circular pools where everyone relieved themselves. Cervantes himself, in a couple of plays he wrote on this subject, said that only the stench could make you think you wouldn't survive. He tried to escape. He knew that for those who tried to flee and were caught, the punishment was impalement. But despite this, Cervantes tried. He gathered some people and attempted a desperate escape into the desert. After 8 days of marching, they were betrayed and brought back to Algiers. Mysteriously, Cervantes was not impaled, even though he had confessed to being the leader of the escape. He was whipped and beaten to the point where he said in his play that he had to sit for 6 months without ever being able to get up due to the pain. But this did not take away his desire to try again. In the meantime, he met other poets and prisoners. One in particular was named Francesco Andreini, an Italian who told him about a project for a play he had already staged because he was both an actor and a playwright. This play was titled The Adventures of Captain Spaventa and His Servant Trappola. Cervantes tried to escape again, but was captured once more. He expected to be impaled this time, but it didn't happen because the Bey of Algiers, the famous and feared Hassan Pasha, the terror of the seas and an officer of the Arab-Turkish Navy, who had raided tens of thousands of Christians taken at a young age and brought to prisons where the alternatives were to become Muslim or remain a slave, had no other choice. This governor of Algiers, one of the most brutal, took Miguel as his personal slave, and Miguel understood why he hadn't been punished, because the Bey of Algiers desired him sexually. Hassan Pasha did not just want a slave, but someone to talk to, and they spoke in Italian, not Arabic, because the feared Turkish Bey of Algiers was Italian. His real name was Andrea Celeste, and he had been raided by the Arabs at the age of 14 in Venice, where he was born and forcibly enlisted in the galleys. At a certain point, Cervantes' mother, Leonor, who had resorted to prostituting herself and pretending to be a widow to raise the 500 scudi needed for her son's ransom, arrived in Algiers. The Bey of Algiers somehow allowed Miguel to return to Spain 12 years after he had left. Cervantes, now in his 30s, maimed and scarred in soul and spirit, returned to Spain with a desire only to write and be a poet. He could no longer bear being a fighter. He had always only sought to write. He had this mysterious attraction to Italian poets whom he considered the greatest of all, and wanted to bring the culture of Italian poetry to Spain as no one had done before. He tried to make his way as a writer while doing all kinds of humble jobs in the meantime. He clashed with several prominent figures in Spain at that time, including the young Lope de Vega, a great emerging playwright who couldn't stand Miguel because he had returned alive from Arab captivity. The suspicion that he had converted, and thus was a renegade, was commonly used at that time to discredit competitors. So they accused him of having sold out to Islam to save his life. This was an accusation that Miguel could never shake off. He then got engaged to a woman he had fallen in love with and who somehow reciprocated his feelings. But unfortunately, this woman was not married to a tavern keeper who, not daring to confront a warrior like Cervantes, tried to have him killed by two hitmen. Miguel managed to kill both of them, but his past came to light. He managed to escape this situation too, but fled from Madrid and took refuge in the countryside, where he married a young girl. Due to economic difficulties, Miguel later had to give up writing forever and took on jobs such as a tax collector. He was often beaten with shovels and sometimes shot at by the peasants he went to collect money from, and he occasionally had to defend himself. All of this only added to the number of charges for assault and violence that were accumulating in his life. When he returned to Valladolid, he discovered that his sisters had set up a sort of brothel, having no money. One evening, a man who frequented his sisters was killed. Naturally, the main suspect was him, and he was arrested. After a year in jail, the real murderer was found by the authorities, and Cervantes was freed. It seemed that fate only presented him with tests of brute courage and never gave him the chance to realize his true dream. But during that year in jail, Cervantes wrote the first part of Don Quixote of La Mancha. He was 59 years old. Publishing his manuscript was not easy. At that time, to publish something, a well-known poet had to write a commendation, what we now call a preface, but no one was willing to do it. Lope de Vega had isolated him, so Miguel realized that the only way to publish his manuscript was to create a fake, to write the preface himself, pretending to be a non-existent poet. He invented the biography of a famous Argentine poet who would have died during the journey between Palo and Argentina. The ship had sunk, but before dying, he had managed to deliver the commendation. This invention was so compelling that a poor printer believed him, and thus he managed to publish the first part of Don Quixote. It was an incredible success. Not only did it have 3 reprints in a month, but it also had 2 translations in English and French within a year. At that time, there were no copyrights, and once you sold to the printer, he took the money and the translators did too, but not the author. So, To earn some more, Miguel brought out everything he had written in the past 20 years: poems, short poems, comedies, a pastoral novel, and published them. He published them, but no one wanted to buy them. After 4 years of unsuccessful publications, he realized that the public wanted the second part of Don Quixote from him, but it was too late because someone else had already written it and was about to publish it under a pseudonym, a certain Alonso de Avellaneda. There are well-founded suspicions among scholars that it was actually that Jerónimo de Pasamonte who had sworn to Cervantes and had poisoned him before the Battle of Lepanto. Cervantes had a fit of rage. His liver literally burst with this news. At that point, realizing he had little time left to live, he hurried to write his second part and proudly signed it, Para el autor de la primera parte, by the author of the first part. In this second part, he did something that even now, more than 400 years later, is incredible. He performed an unparalleled exercise in metafiction. In the second part of Don Quixote, the two protagonists, as soon as they go out, discover that people recognize them on the street, and they ask, "How do you know who we are?" And the people answer, "We read it in a book." "Oh, really? And what did the book say?" "Well, it said that you are heading to Zaragoza for the tournament." "Oh, it said that in the book? And who wrote that nonsense of a book? We are not going to Zaragoza, we are going to Barcelona." And the entire second part of the book is a staging of the fact that they, having become famous as literary characters, deny everything that was written in the so-called apocryphal second part. But his second part of Don Quixote did not interest anyone, and Cervantes spent the last years of his life wandering around like a derelict with this manuscript that no one wanted to publish, because the already published second part was too famous. In Barcelona, he met John Florio for the second time, who had been sent there as a diplomat along with some dignitaries from the royal court, and the two remembered their first meeting, which had taken place 45 years earlier. "What good has your courage done, Miguel?" Florio asked him. "Do you remember when you used to preach to me, telling me I shouldn't hide? What good has it done to live a life of hardship?" And Cervantes replied, "Mine has been a life full of honor, and yours, John? How many skirts have you hidden behind to avoid telling the world who you were, to avoid facing the dangers and consequences that would have come from revealing who you were? Who of us has led the worse life?" Florio knew that Cervantes was right, but he didn't admit it. He bought the second part of Don Quixote from him for a small amount of money, intending to translate it himself in England. Cervantes never saw his book published. He died before, but he lived long enough to see that Florio had stolen 3 plays from this second part, signed by William Shakespeare. Cervantes died knowing that he had made something of his life far more passionate than anything he had written, because as you can understand, there is no novel by Cervantes, nor perhaps by any other author, that can equal everything I have told you and that really happened. Here ends the narration by Stefano Reali, but not the story. Reali continues with what he calls a postscript. It's the epilogue, set shortly before Florio dies. Florio has fallen into disgrace, forgotten by everyone, but has one last burst of pride and summons Mephistopheles. He evokes him as John Dee had taught him, as Giordano Bruno had also taught him. He summons him and the entity manifests itself, and Mephistopheles says to him, "I want to know what you want from me." John Florio, on his deathbed, responds, "I want another chance. Give me another chance. Give me another life where I can safeguard my literary talent, but give me the courage to put my name on what I will write. Give me this courage. I want to relive a life keeping this talent, but with the courage to put my face on what I will do." Mephistopheles responds, "The price will be high. I don't care. I cannot die having led a life devoid of meaning, a life I am ashamed of. Everything screams against my shame, and I don't want to leave this world like this." Mephistopheles grants his wish, and so at the moment Florio dies, at that precise moment, he is reincarnated 70 years earlier, just as Giordano Bruno had theorized. A soul can inhabit multiple universes, and therefore multiple bodies if the universes are contiguous. He had written about it in 1582 and on the infinite universe and worlds. And so Giovanni Florio reincarnates, He reincarnates into the body of the young Miguel de Cervantes, who from childhood was irresistibly drawn to everything Italian.